Welcome to Holy Smokes, my first live stream on this channel. And the title for it is, What Even Is This Channel? Right, because I haven't done anything with it. I had a great interview with Father Ripperger that I posted, did a little martyr video, and I was like, oh, great, we're going to do all these videos. And then a week goes by, and I was like, I can't get a video together. Because I guess it shows how much I stink at this whole grifting thing. So I'm just decided, I want to do a live stream. I just want to talk about things casually, not make anything really serious and concerted. So the question is, all right, so let's just answer the question. What is this channel? And, and I thought about it. Well, what kind of stuff do I want to do? Or do we need just another trad Catholic channel in tweed smoking to do things? I'm always in tweed smoking. Actually, I'm not always in tweed, but I'm always smoking. So that's one thing I always actually do. It's not something I just pick up for live streams, although it does seem to infuriate some boomers, so that's good. But no, really, what even is the channel, right? And so the channel is basically devoted to my nerddom, the type of things that I'd like to do, things I like to talk about, history, but not politics. That's the thing. Everyone's on politics. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say about politics, because I don't like anything going on in politics. And well, there's another political guy just talking about stuff. We don't need that. We don't need any more of that. Same with the trad Catholic vibe. Do we need more trad channels talking about Vatican II and the new mass? And there's enough of those out there. And people probably do it better than I would do it. So it's not a particular thing or a particular focus that I want to end on. So, not going to be a Trump channel, not going to be, I don't know, whatever channels, really just something, for my own amusement to do stuff on history that people hopefully will find interesting. And if not, well, I enjoyed it. So there is that. First thing I happen to note in a comment, we have, you're going live with Holy Smokes at 4:20. You know what you're doing. Well, actually, I didn't think about it because it's 3:20 Pacific time, but or was. So, but nevertheless, that is kind of a humorous accident, but not that 4:20. So today, I want to, lay out again, what the channel's about. So like I said, history topics, and, we could do things on Tudor history, War of Spanish Succession. I've been writing books on for years. I don't know, probably be videos and that sort of thing more so than live streams, but guests on live streams, all that's in the future as I, get it nailed down and get my time nailed down. So I wanted to do a couple of things. And of course, it's historic today because King Charles III is going to Washington, visiting the president. And there's a lot of, talk about that. So I thought of doing something English history and along the vein of what I've been writing on in certain places. Like if you follow it at Pelican Plus, which there's some rumors it's dying down. Everything I've been told, it's still going. So I write there, and I write mostly on history. Right now I'm writing on Tudor history, specifically the marriage of Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon. So I wanted to pick up on something that I had to relegate to a footnote in those articles. I wanted to make a big, discussion of this, and I really, didn't. What happened with Katherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur? And did they, the more important question, did they consummate the marriage? So I pulled up this article that I want to read, and I want to talk about a little bit, and I have some other things. So as you probably know, Katherine of Aragon was first married to Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur Tudor. Okay, and as part of his name too, as part of Henry VII, giving the notion of the rebirth of English monarchy, playing into those Arthurian notions. And had it actually not been for Prince Arthur's death, King Arthur legend and lore might have been some of the big national play and myth making of England, but it ends up not happening that way. And King Arthur myths are generally more Welsh, and then you have Thomas Malory in the Middle Ages, and they don't really get rediscovered until the 19th century because Arthur's death kind of puts a kibosh on that whole thing. But nevertheless, so as we know, with the case of the divorce of Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon, Katherine maintained that she was never carnally known by her brother, Henry's brother, Prince Arthur. And that becomes the bedrock of her case, why all the proceedings to an annulment on the grounds that Henry's looking for are false. So And I just had to kind of note, that going through some of the history on that, because it's a bit muddled. Is it the case that Prince Arthur Carnley knew Princess Catherine at that time? And she maintains not, and there's good arguments for it. So I noted in the Pelican Plus article I wrote that at the time on the Spanish side, you have the principal lady in Catherine's household, Doña Elvira. She clearly indicates to Isabella and Ferdinand that it was not so, and she sends documents that they had not consummated the marriage prior to Arthur dying. And again, on the English side, there's some question about it, and then there's other courtiers that claim that he did, and it most certainly took place. And so, how do we sort through some of this? So I'm going to go through this article from the Tudor Enthusiast, a good blog to keep track of. Do we still do blogs? I guess we do. Anyway, so she's going to go into the background here. I think we'll skip into that. So the question ultimately becomes, did Catherine really consummate the marriage? So I'm going to start reading here. This is the author. One thing that I've heard many people say about the topic is that Katherine of Aragon would never have told such a great lie, being a devout and extremely religious woman that she was. People will argue that, quote, she was too good a Catholic, or, quote, she would have felt tremendous guilt, unquote, for telling such a lie, and that her conscience simply wouldn't allow it. While I agree, and I think everyone can, that Catherine was an admirably pious and Catholic woman, we have to remember that people in the 16th century saw things a bit differently than we do now, and that even matters of religion can be a little fuzzy. In many cases, royals and nobles considered themselves destined for the throne by God's will, and they would do whatever they had to do in order to fulfill God's command to them. As we see later on, once Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII is in shambles, she fiercely refuses to be known as anything other than Queen of England. When the king's men refer to her as the proper new title, Dowager Princess, she continues to correct them, saying that she will die as the rightful and God-anointed queen. Besides, on her opinion and behavior in these matters, I think it's safe to say that she felt quite passionate about her place on the English throne. Think about it. From the time she was a baby, she was told and treated like she was going to be a queen. She grew up thinking and learning it. That was her duty. Why then wouldn't a woman do everything she could in order to fulfill that duty, even if it meant telling a great lie? By telling a lie like this from the time Arthur died, she must have known she would be considered as Prince Henry's bride, thus becoming the queen she had always prepared to be. Later, of course, this lie would serve as an attempt to keep her on the throne and as Henry's wife. As long as it was in favor of God's will, she must have believed it was, then it may have been okay in her eyes. As for the question of Catherine's guilt, there is evidence later in her life of that. Interestingly enough, it has been recorded that near the end of her second marriage, and within the last few years of her life, she had begun wearing hair shirts, which was a form of penitence for sins in the Catholic faith. I don't agree with this, by the way, but I'm just laying the ground for what we're going to discuss. These shirts were worn underneath other clothes and brushed against the body in a painful way, reminding you of your sins and unworthiness of God's forgiveness. Another known wearer of hair shirts was the extremely devoted Thomas More, who would die for his beliefs in the Catholic faith and his refusal to accept King Henry VIII as supreme head of the church. Of course, it is possible that Catherine, being the pious woman that she was, wanted to wear the hair shirt simply because it was part of her beliefs. But the timing is a bit ironic, isn't it? Although I have not found the exact dates that she is recorded to have been wearing them, the fact that they were in her later years tells me that it was around the time she was vehemently arguing her case to the king and the bishops, cardinals, and even the Pope himself. Perhaps telling all of these people that she had not consummated her marriage to Arthur, when she really had, was cause for a guilty conscience, and this was her form of penance. Now, I'd like to take things over to Arthur Tudor, since there are some very interesting pieces of evidence that we can look at. First of all, it has been said that he was always a weak and unhealthy child, and this may have been reason enough for him not to consummate the marriage with Catherine. But there actually is no evidence of this, and never was there any mention of his frailty when describing him. In fact, the Marquis of Dorset reported that Arthur was of good and sanguine complexion, hardly what you would call sickly. Also, prior to his marriage, Arthur is reported to have said that he found his bride very pleasing and that he was feeling, quote, lusty and amorous, unquote. It's unlikely that a sickly and weak boy would be saying or feeling such a thing, and his words did not seem to baffle people or cause any suspicions at the time. If he were indeed a sickly prince, people would very likely have questioned such a statement. Another important point is that this marriage was political. It was made in an effort to form a strong alliance between England and Spain, two of the superpowers in Europe. I mean, that's not quite true as far as England. England was seen as an up and coming power and as beneficial ally, but not as a superpower. England was seen as a power to tip the balance between, say, Spain and France, not powerful in its own right. But anyway, that's another. Plus, they had an in with the Habsburgs, and the coalescence in the politics of that time were toward a Habsburg ruler on the Spanish throne. They were aware of that. When Isabel and Ferdinand's son died, that was Charles, who was their grandson. He was the only heir that really could take the throne. So they knew that was coming, and Henry was already a great ally of the Habsburgs. And actually, at some point, I should do a show on the Henry VII and the Habsburgs and how he forges that alliance and how that'll continue. But anyway, so after taking note of that statement, we'll continue here. Would King Ferdinand really have agreed to and held up the promise of marriage for his daughter to a weak and sickly prince? ? Well, maybe. Such a thing would be very unlikely, and considering the betrothal had lasted all throughout Catherine's childhood, there would have been plenty of time for the Spanish king and queen to call off the arrangement, seeking a healthier match for their daughter. The fact that no mention was ever made of this makes the question of Arthur's bad health extremely unlikely in the eyes of many historians. It's also worth mentioning that, for the majority of Catherine and Arthur's marriage, they lived at Ludlow Castle, a dark, drafty, secluded, and cold castle, certainly not the place for a sickly and wildly valuable prince. The reports of Catherine and Arthur's wedding night would also give every indication that their marriage was consummated. Although they were both only 15 years old, this was considered the perfect age for marriage and childbearing at this time. And certainly, there had been cases for much younger women becoming pregnant, such as Lady Margaret Beaufort, who gave birth to Henry VII when she was 12. It's actually false. She gave when she was 13, but conceived, which and this perplexes modern people. I should pause here to note this, is that modern people, you get married at 12 and you're just thinking all like, you go down, this is like pedo stuff, right? But in those days, this is the way it normally worked, especially for a royal bride. I have to relight that. So for a royal bride, you were raised to be a wife. And this is even true for non-royals, except that you just didn't have all the ceremonies the royals had, right? But arranged marriages were somewhat normal. And a lot of times they actually turned out happy, although it's hard for us to imagine that would be the case, but sometimes they do. And if you are raised, a lot of times you might have a betrothal as early as 6, 7. Catherine and Henry's daughter, Mary, was betrothed at the age of 6 to the French Dauphin and then to Charles V, one who was an infant and one who was a 20-something-year-old man, right? And then they get married, later when the betrothal would finally come to, and a lot of times it would happen by proxy. There would be somebody who would pronounce the vows in place of the actual groom or bride, and then they would come later, and then there would be a ceremony to fulfill all that, and then it would be, the marriage would take place. So in the case of Catherine, she goes in person. There had been ceremonial proxies prior to that point, but now it was all done in person when she gets to England and marries Arthur, right? So a 12-year-old oftentimes would find they would go through all that formal ceremony, but she still would not be carnally known until she was later, 14. Now, technically, it was one of these things in jurists parsing things that 12 would be the legally permissible age for carnal knowledge, which again, beggars our imagination. We can't imagine this. But it simply wasn't normally done until you were at least 14. That's just the way that a lot of these things carried out in an age where, your life is often cut short, especially for nobility in war, disease, what have you. So Catherine, is married at 15, right, along with Prince Arthur. And it's, again, this is not what modern people do, but it is kind of normal for them. But 12 is not normal. Okay. It might be normal for like taking possession of her in the household as a bride. It's not normal for the actual consummation, right? And it's even against it's considered downright indecent by the standards of the time. So that's just something I wanted to note real quick. But anyway, so getting back to this article, the reports of Catherine and Arthur's wedding night would also give every indication that their marriage was consummated, although they were both only 15 years old. This was considered the perfect age for marriage and childbearing at the time. Or I already read that, I'm sorry. So let me read this quote. And she's given this quote from Dr. David Starkey's The Six Wives of Henry VIII, which we get to. What happened then, only God knows. The herald, a strictly contemporary witness, assumed that nature had taken its course, and thus these worthy persons concluded and consummated the effect and complement of matrimony. Okay, and so the book, I actually have the book here that she's quoting from, and Dr. Starkey gives other sources for people at the time who felt that Catherine had in fact been properly betrothed to Prince Arthur. So, or properly bedded and consummated by Prince Arthur. So, and this will draw this to a close here. Catherine and Arthur would have been put to bed in a very public ceremony, as newly married royals were. They would have, it's called the bedding, by the way. There would have been people to help Arthur prepare for bed and see that he was properly situated with his new wife. Even the Marquis of Dorset reported recalling that Arthur had gotten into bed besides Catherine, who was lying underneath the coverlet. So the two certainly went to bed together. At that point, there's plenty of evidence. Who could have stopped them from consummating the marriage at this point? Interestingly, Arthur made some significant comments the morning after his wedding night with Catherine, asking one of his servants to fetch him a cup of ale and saying, "For I have been this night in the midst of Spain." Later, the prince as openly said, "Masters, it is good pastime to have a wife." Some people have read these statements and believe that Arthur was simply covering up the fact that he has not consummated his marriage, perhaps telling lies and acting overly excited about this new bedmate. However, I think it's a bit of a stretch. It was common in the 16th century for men to brag about their wives and the excitements of the bedchamber. Why should Arthur be any different? As a self-professed lusty and amorous teenager, I don't think it's at all odd that he would say such things, and these are certainly comments that stuck in men's minds once Catherine began insisting that her marriage had not been consummated years later. And actually, I should make a point about that. Nobody really remembered these things until the Henry VIII starts the process for the annulment with Catherine, and Catherine's side in her position is then, laid bare, and they start looking back. They have to start finding people. And that's where the evidence, there's not a lot of contemporary evidence, even for some of these statements that are read here. It's people remembering 20 years later what had been said and done, right? So let me get down to this, and then we can get to our conclusion and move on to the next bit. So one piece of information that causes some historians to question everything, though, is that Catherine's duenna, Doña Elvira, who insisted that the princess had never consummated the marriage. Interestingly enough, the duenna and Catherine were never close, and Doña Elvira would even end up betraying Catherine in another matter later on. Yet, she would never go back on her insistence that Catherine had not consummated her marriage with Arthur. Dr. David Starkey says in his book, she, Doña Elvira, and all the matrons of her lady's household would swear of their personal knowledge that Princess Catherine was virgo intacta, and examination by qualified persons would prove as much. Unquote. So if the duenna had been lying, and if an examination of Catherine had truly taken place, the consequences of such a lie would be great, and Doña Elvira would have never been able to face Queen Isabella of Castile again. And what she's saying here is actually taken from the biographer of Katherine of Aragon, a man named Garrett Mattingly. And that's the whole case that Mattingly makes for why it's probably true that Catherine had not actually consummated the marriage with Arthur. So unless Catherine had lied to her about the lack of consummation, it might be unlikely that the duenna would have taken such a risk for a princess that she didn't even get along with well. Why risk the wrath of the rulers of two European powers? All right, and then she goes on. Well, the overall evidence, in her opinion, in the author's opinion, is that, well, yeah, it's Catherine must have obviously consummated this marriage to Prince Arthur, right? And and that may be true, but on the other hand, there's other evidence. So there's another historian that I'll quote from. So a Dr. Antonia Fraser, okay, and now she notes all of this particular evidence, but she has something different to say. And so I'm reading here. By one of those ironic twists of fate to which history is prone, the question of the sexual relationship, if any, between these two innocent adolescents would become of paramount importance nearly 30 years later. By then, one of the two had been dead almost as long. The other was facing the most desperate crisis of her life. There is no contemporary record of Prince Arthur's views on the subject, and one must surely leave aside the vulgar gossip produced so conveniently many years later by courtiers who manifestly hoped to serve the interest of their master. Because remember, there's no scrap of paper or witness in any of the acts relating to Prince Arthur's death of anyone making the statements from courtiers, for example, claiming that Arthur said, "I've been in the midst of Spain." These were produced later during the legatine trial of Henry VIII to answer Catherine's side of the argument before the legatine court. So one is therefore left with Catherine's unwavering assertions dating from 1502 onwards, not from late 1520s like the courtiers' tales, that the marriage was consummated. There was, however, a third person entitled to express a first-hand view of this delicate, if vital point, as it turned out to be. Catherine's second husband, Henry VIII. He, after all, had either found her to be a virgin on their own wedding night, as he used to boast in his youth, or had not. It can be argued that Catherine herself, like Henry's courtiers, was not an unbiased witness. In that case, more convincing evidence of a non-consummation is provided by the fact that Henry VIII himself, in later life, never gave Catherine the lie on the subject, when publicly challenged to deny that he had found her a maid when he married her. No, actually, I disagree with the doctor here for this reason, is that when Henry, this happens at the legatine court. Catherine comes, gets off the dais, goes across the court, and goes to Henry directly and challenges him, "Did you not find me a maid on our night?" And Henry's in a bit of emotional turmoil. This is supposed to be his moment to steamroll the whole process through. And yet, here's Catherine playing to the crowd, all the people gathered at Blackfriars to witness the whole trial. And he's put on the spot. He's never good when challenged by women. Actually, Anne Boleyn will chide Henry later that he'd never won an argument with Catherine in his life. And this was an occasion. She's unmanning him before the crowd. So he's probably not he's not quick on his feet when challenged. So he's probably not thinking about it. So the fact that Henry didn't deny it here, as he denies it later. So, but the fact he doesn't deny it during the legatine court when Catherine's making such a spectacle doesn't necessarily, give the proof. Just the same. Dr. Fraser continues, "Let us return to the winter of 1501, in the brief months of married life which Arthur and Catherine enjoyed following their ceremonial wedding and bedding at Baynard's Castle. Arthur's physical immaturity and lack of growth, even shorter than his admittedly tiny wife, has already been stressed. This is in itself no proof that he had not reached puberty, although it makes it seem unlikely. And even if he had not reached it in November, he might have reached it at some point during the next few months. Catherine's story years later in the confessional to Cardinal Campeggio was that they had shared a bed on only 7 occasions, and at no time had Arthur known her. But what really stands against the notion of the consummation of the union, all subsequent allegations apart, is the custom of the time was all against it. In an age when marriages were frequently contracted for reasons of state between children of those hovering between childhood and adolescence, more care rather than less was taken over the timing of consummation. Once the marriage was officially completed, some years might pass before the appropriate moment was judged to have arrived. And I mentioned this as one of the reasons why you might take possession of a bride at 12, if you're some noble somewhere, but not actually carnally know her until 14 or 15. So anxious reports might pass between ambassadors on physical development. Royal parents might take advice on their offspring's readiness for the ordeal. The comments sometimes remind one of those breeders discussing the mating of thoroughbred stock, and the comparison is indeed not so far off. The siring of progeny was an essential next step in these royal marriages, so endlessly negotiated. Where an heiress was concerned, her spoiling by being obliged to have sex and bear children too young, might have important consequences. The physique of the great heiress Margaret Beaufort was considered to have been ruined by early childbearing. She bore the future Henry VII when she was only 13 and never had any other children in the course of 4 marriages. Henry survived, but the existence of a single heir was in principle a great risk to any family in the age of high infant mortality, as the shortage of Tudor heirs would continuously demonstrate. Negotiations for the marriage of James IV, King of Scotland, and Arthur's sister, Princess Margaret, had begun in 1498. The trouble was that the bride was only 9, while the King of Scots was 25. Both Princess Margaret's mother and her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, the latter with an obvious grim interest in the subject, worried about the age gap and pleaded for the marriage ceremony itself to be held off lest consummation follow. Quote, they fear the King of Scots would not wait, but injure her and endanger her health. And they were finally married in 1503, and of course she was 14. So continuing, the health of the bridegroom was taken equally seriously. For instance, it was firmly believed by the Spanish court physicians that Catherine's brother, the Infante Juan, had weakened himself by spending so much time in bed with his wife, with disastrous consequences. I'll let you make of that what you will. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, illegitimate son of Henry VIII, was married off to Lady Mary Howard when he was 14, but the marriage remained unconsummated at his premature death of tuberculosis 3 years later. No doubt it was the thought that the act would prove too taxing for one of doubtful health. Mary Howard's brother, Thomas, Earl of Surrey, lived with Lady Frances Vere for 3 years after the marriage before consummation when they were both 15. In the case of Arthur and Catherine, all 4 parents apparently agreed that nothing should be rushed. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were anxious to protect their son's health, while Ferdinand and Isabella made it clear they too would rather be pleased than dissatisfied if consummation were delayed for some time, in view of Arthur's tender age. These were the instructions related to Dona Elvira, we've already mentioned the duenna, which, as a resolute duenna, she could be trusted to carry out. The plan, therefore, was for Catherine to remain in London, under the tutelage of her mother-in-law, not forgetting her dominating grandmother-in-law, while Arthur was to be allowed to continue his growing up, undisturbed by the distractions of a wife in the marches of Wales at Ludlow Castle. But this plan, which had an agreeably human side to it, Catherine would learn to know her new family, and also learn English before she attempted to forge a proper relationship with her husband, was not carried out. Instead, Catherine, Princess of Wales, set off for Ludlow in December. The change of plan, which infuriated the Spaniards, came back to money. That is, the question of Catherine's dowry. The principle of the dowry, for princesses as for human affluent girls of the period, was a payment by the parents now in return for the promise of financial support from her husband's estate later. Thus, Ferdinand had agreed to hand over 200,000 crowns on his daughter's marriage, on condition that Catherine, if widowed, was to receive 1/3 of the revenues of Wales, Cornwall, and Chester. Of the promised 200,000 crowns, however, Ferdinand had so far only delivered half. He suddenly announced that a substantial portion of the remaining sum due, 35,000 crowns, was in fact being consigned in plate and jewels. This was definitely stealing a march on the English king, for whom, like most monarchs of the time, cash was an essential but elusive commodity. We shouldn't forget that Henry VII is also looking for money to send over to the Habsburgs and keep fashioning that alliance. It did not take Henry VII long to come up with the Machiavellian counterplan, for in this respect, Ferdinand and Henry were well-matched players. Supposing the Princess of Wales was sent to Ludlow, the establishment of her household there would inevitably involve the considerable deployment of plate and jewels, commensurate with the status in which the Spaniards were so keen. To do this, she would have to use her own plate. This, in turn, would make it difficult for the Spanish king to have these same, now second-hand jewels and plate re-emerge as part of the dowry owed to Henry VII. The Spaniards in London, Don Pedro de Ayala in particular, were wise to the plot without being able to do anything about it. At least they fought a rearguard action by refusing to take Henry's decision for him or let their princess do so. The king mused aloud as to whether the princess should depart and confided to de Ayala that his indecision was shared by his council, some of whom thought it was good for her to go to Ludlow, others not. Next, he asked Arthur to persuade Catherine to volunteer to accompany him. Catherine refused. So the king was obliged to consult Catherine herself, at which she swept, metaphorically speaking, another of her deep curtsies and responded most graciously that she had no other will but the king's own. King Henry's bluff was called. With a great show of sorrow, he ordered Catherine to go with her husband. And so to the marches of Wales, finally Catherine went, with a considerable Spanish train, including Doña Elvira, as Isabella's watchful surrogate and a Spanish chaplain. Ludlow Castle was another historic residence of the House of York, but one with less fortunate connotations than Bayard's Castle. And we'll skip all that. We don't need to go into that. We just get to the meat here. Let's see. On the Welsh borders that spring, the weather was notably cold and wet, as a result of which sickness of various types was rife. Towards the ends of March 1502, Prince Arthur's fragile health began to give way. It's interesting, as the last author is talking about how he didn't have fragile health, but he still dies really young, so something was amiss here. The prince may have been suffering from tuberculosis. There was also an outbreak of plague in the neighborhood and an epidemic of another scourge of the times known as the sweating sickness. This disease was much feared by contemporaries for its mysterious course. Victims did recover, but others died, some within 3 hours, some within 2 hours, some merry at dinner and dead at supper, as a chronicle reported it. The sweating sickness seems the most likely explanation, since Catherine also collapsed. She was still seriously ill on 2nd April when Prince Arthur died. He was 15 and a half. His dearest spouse was now his widow. Katherine of Aragon, at the age of 16 and 3 months, had become the Princess Dowager of Wales. If she contemplated her own death during this period of her sickness, Catherine could surely have echoed the wry little epitaph once suggested by her sister-in-law, the Archduchess Margaret, for herself. She had been married, yet encore et pucelle, still remained a maid. And so we could go on. And one of the things that Weir will mention through the book, and Dr. Fraser will mention through the book, I was thinking of another historian, also with an A name, Allison, is that Arthur may not have, she mentioned it, she may not have fully gone through puberty. Okay. Now, because normally we look at this question from the standpoint of, well, come on, young girl, young boy, is there any way in which they're really going to not consummate that marriage? Well, if it's and as we find on this occasion, one is sickly, maybe he's not in the mood, or maybe it's something akin to Louis XVI. As we know, some people know that story. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had a very difficult time and leaving her very frustrated sexually, because Louis XVI just simply did not know what to do. And it was the Austrian Emperor Joseph II who decides to give him some practical advice on how to make love to his wife, because he didn't know, right? Sometimes these things happen. I don't know exactly why you would be leaving important things like this out of your education of a young man, but here we are. So could Arthur have been in a similar situation, or been somewhat stunted, not having fully gone through a late puberty? It's not impossible. There's some descriptions of the time that suggest it. And in that vein, could it be the case that Catherine and Arthur really did not consummate the marriage? And I think there's a good case to be made here that it's not. It's not so much that Catherine would never have recourse to something. What if here's another twist to this? What if it's the case that the marriage was consummated, or somewhat consummated, at least in such a way where she was not actually intacta, right? Or maybe partially consummated. And Catherine, if she herself had not been given much explanation and much knowledge on this particular point, what if she didn't understand quite what had happened? And her own memories of it confused over the next 6-7 years before she is finally married to Henry in 1509. What if she herself was ignorant of matters sexual and thought of herself. So in her own conscience, she is quite correct that she was a maid, except then wouldn't have been. It's interesting that way. We don't, of course, we don't know. It's one of those problems. It's an insoluble problem, as I mentioned in my own article on this. And can the historian, know Catherine is lying or Catherine's not? And so I don't think I'm inclined to say that Catherine is not lying. So, and I would actually argue that way. If the marriage was in fact consummated with Prince Arthur, then it was in such a way where she didn't quite understand what had happened. So in conscience, she's telling the truth when she says that she's a maid. And you also have contemporary evidence from Henry VIII, on the other hand, that he says, that he boasts to the fact that she was a maid in 1509, 1510, when he married her, because it was a bit of esteem. Perfect way to lay his claim to her, by the way. So we ultimately don't know. Neither did the Pope, really. The papal court doesn't seem to have had accurate information about this. They sent a brief to Spain, which had all of the matter of the dispensation for Catherine to marry Prince Henry, and stated as a fact that he had carnally known her. Isabella and Ferdinand were furious about this, and Isabella demanded from Julius II that he provide something to her to give an indication that she was not carnally known. So then he writes the bull, which will become the subject of debate when Henry initiates the divorce, which then is a shorter form than the brief, even though the terms suggest otherwise, right? And they just say, perhaps, forsan is the Latin word that's used in it, perhaps had been carnally known. And Isabella then is satisfied. She dies shortly thereafter. And, and the rest, of course, is history. That saga continues. Catherine has a good deal of time waiting with a very poor household. She's not being well provided for. And Henry VII is souring on negotiations with the Spanish. He's thinking about even dealing with the French. And then he dies. Henry VIII cuts away all of the red tape that his father had set up and marries Catherine for love. So anyway, I hope that's been interesting anyway to discuss that particular point. I think personally that it's more probable they didn't consummate the marriage, and I kind of follow Dr. Fraser on that. However, it's possible they did, like I said, in that such a way. But I don't think, and then you see things. Well, look, like in the article we read, oh, Catherine was wearing a hair shirt. She must have been making up for a sin. Catherine is a devout woman. She has just seen the man she thought she knew as her husband. She thought she understood. Cast her aside for this other woman and do the most monstrous things to her, and now witnesses from afar him doing the most monstrous things to their daughter, right? To isolate them and psychologically browbeat them both. Catherine is lamenting her fate at the end of her life, and she's probably wearing a hair shirt as a matter of religious devotion, because every Christian knows that they have sinned. Every Christian knows they have fallen short of the mark. And wearing a hair shirt is not just a sign of expunging a specific sin, but of trying to get closer to God in your final days, or in your general devotions. St. John Fisher is the Bishop of Rochester during the same period. He had a hair shirt, which and a whip. And, he's known as being one of the holiest bishops in England and in Christendom itself. He's celebrated by theologians throughout the next couple hundred years. It's actually sad that in the English language, we've kind of forgotten John Fisher. Everything focuses on More, who is great. But then everyone forgets the really pivotal role that Fisher had. And most theologians, they didn't really remember More. They remembered Fisher. In Bishops and Saintly Men, St. Charles Borromeo, he had a portrait of John Fisher in Milan alongside St. Ambrose as his models. Ambrose, the founder of the See, and John Fisher as a model bishop. St. Robert Bellarmine had the life of St. John Fisher specifically brought to him so that he could read it daily as he embarked on being the bishop in Capua. Francisco Victoria, the founder of Salamanca, he also had a portrait of St. John Fisher and called him the very model of bishops in Christendom, so, as well as one of the greatest theologians of the age. He wore a hair shirt and whipped himself. And so that, the fact that she had a hair shirt did not mean that she was guilty. She was conscious of lying about having been a virgin when she married Henry. So that's, but anyway, so I just wanted to elaborate kind of on that subject. And if I actually, it's funny. I write for Pelican Plus. They pay me. I don't even know if you can view the articles if, like, with a free account or something. Maybe you can, or part of them. To talk to them, see if I can get some kind of promotion going so people can read all of them. Maybe it'll drive some traffic there. Who knows? But the, is I'm writing a lot on that subject of the divorce, and I'll probably do some shows on that in the future on the divorce between Henry VIII and Catherine. So, but there was one more thing, and given my namesake, I thought it was something. I just find it to be a really interesting story. Is that the recently, a couple days ago, we had kind of the anniversary of the birth of Ulysses S. Grant, and of course, I am somewhat related tangentially, not directly, to Ulysses S. Grant. Comes the line, which again, it goes back to the Mayflower line of Grants. Whereas most people that name Grant in this country, they actually came over after Culloden. He actually came over from Scotland. So the Jacobite entry point, whereas the English Grants come on the Mayflower. And so anyway, so Ulysses S. Grant, and this is yesterday, of course, was born 204 years ago today. His name wasn't even Ulysses S. Grant. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant in Point Pleasant, Ohio, on 27th April, 1822. Ohio also be where my wife is from. The congressman who nominated him to West Point wrote down the wrong name. Grant kept it. The S stands for nothing. I just got to pause. I love this point. I love this idea that Grant was, somebody gave him the wrong name, and he owns it. He rocks it. He says, all right, we're going to go with this. And the S doesn't stand for anything. It's hilarious. He hated his father's tannery and loved horses. Graduated 21st of 39 at West Point. Fought in the Mexican-American War, then came home convinced it was an unjust war designed to expand slavery. He later said he believed the Civil War was divine punishment for it. And I should add, actually, Grant's quote on this is actually pretty, and I 100% agree with it, is that the Mexican-American War was the most unjust war in the history of this country. At some point, I'm gonna do some more on that. But he married Julia Dent in 1848 into a slave-owning Missouri family. Kind of got to stop and marvel at this for a minute, because on the other side, Robert E. Lee never owned a slave. His abolitionist father refused to attend the wedding. In 1859, broke and desperate, Grant freed the one enslaved man he briefly owned instead of selling him. He could have gotten a year's wages. In the Civil War, he became what no other Union general was, relentless. And this is something that needs to be said. I'm not necessarily a strong historian on the Civil War like I am in other things and other conflicts, but one of the things that you see in most of the conflicts through 1864 is that the Confederate side has the better generals and they have the better tactics. But Grant understood what the North had above all, manpower. And he was brutal, actually, a lot like Patton, just he had more men to throw into things, but he wasn't completely without tactics or without, sense, right? Even though he wasn't nearly as good a general as Lee, but he understood that here's the way you win the war. You be relentless. So Vicksburg, 4th July, 1863, split the Confederacy in half. Lincoln then gave him every Union army. His Appomattox surrender terms, officers kept sidearms, men kept horses for spring planting. No one prosecuted. And this is actually really interesting. I know Lincoln actually wasn't too happy about this, but at least in all of its details, some of them. Grant looked at Lee and he wanted it to be understood. You are brothers in arms. We're divided. And this is the notion of the men fighting the Civil War, is that we're brothers sundered by these politics and these issues. And so he allowed the Confederate soldiers to leave with honors as military men who'd fought, not, just destroyed like in some Nuremberg trial or something like that, which I'm sure the left would love to dig up the corpses of Confederates today to do that. It was, you leave with your sidearms, you leave with military honors, you take your horses, right? Today, I don't think that you could ever do such a thing. But as president, 1869, 1877, he did something no president would do again until LBJ. He used federal troops to crush the Ku Klux Klan. He suspended habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties, prosecuted Klansmen before predominantly black juries, and broke the first Klan. His presidency was also rocked by scandal. Black Friday, 1869, Credit Mobilier, the Whiskey Ring, Belknap. Grant himself never took a dime. He was just disastrously loyal to corrupt friends. The pattern damaged his reputation for a century. After the White House, he toured the world for 2 years, dined with Queen Victoria, met the Emperor of Japan. Then in 1884, a Wall Street partner named Ferdinand Ward ran what we now call a Ponzi scheme. Grant was wiped out, 62 years old and penniless. Weeks later, he was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. Mark Twain offered to publish his memoirs. Grant wrote in agony, sometimes 50 pages a day, racing the disease to leave Julia an inheritance. He finished the manuscript 18th July, 1885, and he died 23rd July. The book made Julia $450,000, about $14 million today. It's now considered one of the finest memoirs in the English language, actually, and it is. For decades, historians ranked Grant a failure. Since 2000, he's jumped 13 spots in the C-SPAN survey, the biggest rise of any president. Happy birthday, General. So I just thought I'd read that. It's interesting. I tend to have more sympathies, like divided on the Confederate side, which is hard because, obviously anti-slavery. But there's a lot on the Confederate side to recommend itself specifically for, not so much in the politicians, but in the troops who fought that war. It's one of these double betrayals. You're a planter in Virginia. You're a freeholder. You couldn't afford a slave, even if you wanted one. I mean, their views on black people are what today would probably be called racist. I'm not even touching that question. I don't even want to deal with that. The modern ideas about it, more the contemporary ideas, and they feel betrayed by the federal government, right, over the invasion that's taken place of their territory, their states, by Lincoln. So they go to war, but then they're betrayed again by their own Confederate leadership, which is doing everything to benefit the planters, the plantation owners, who absolutely want to keep slaves. And you see this desperation in letters at the end of the war, Confederates saying, well, why are we fighting so the plantationers can keep their damn Negroes, set in context. They did not, like that, right? And so it's a horrible time for anyone in the South, unless you're a part of the privileged class, the protected class. And so Grant, he was a man of the time. He was not without vices. He had a lot of them. One, he was a shameless drunk. I feel that, although I'm not drinking anything at the moment. He had he was known in the Army for being a drunk. So when people, came in and said, oh no, look, here he comes, Grant would ride to view the troops with a teacup. He'd ride around with a teacup just to allay everybody's fear and suspicion that he was actually really a drunk. It is fascinating that way at the extents that you'd go to. So, all right, let me pick up a few comments here. Let's see. This is back on the earlier thing with Katherine of Aragon. As pious as she was, she's still human, thus as rotten as the rest of us. White lie, lying, liar. Okay, and I see you went for the rest of it. Yes. Okay. I see what you're getting at. Yeah. And that may be true, and again, because there are no white lies. Every lie is bad. However, we can understand, would I do anything different in a similar situation? If there's some piece that would completely undo everything? I don't know. I like to think that I'll acquit myself well, but haven't been tried yet on something like that. So God forbid. And yes, you're welcome. So that's two, stories in history. And I love, these are the things I really love doing. Love getting in, especially into the, getting through books of historians, noting their primary sources, go back. And a lot of those I've already read, like in the Tudor stuff. And a lot of those are easily available. That's the best thing. They talk about gunboat diplomacy, the British Empire of the 19th century. I'm going to have to relight afterward. And the British would go around to various places, seizing, control of things with gunboats. Well, they also had gunboat document acquisition, right? Is that they would go with guns to take any state papers from Spain, from Venice, from all these places, that anything that pertained to England. So you have all these calendars of state papers, Spanish, Venetian, and other things, which are were taken and then translated, and they're in the British archives. And now you can find those. Thankfully, they're online. So it makes them dreadfully easy to read. I don't need to get special access and time and money to travel to England to sit there and read things in archives. I can find it online, putting the internet to good use for a change, thank God. So that is, that's what I love doing. And so hopefully these will answer, what even is this channel, right? Get away from what everyone else is doing. The endless stuff, Trump this, Biden that, I don't know whether we're a few years off Biden, thank goodness, but, and everyone wants to divide over that. Trump versus the Pope this, Vatican II this, tradition this, I don't need to be doing that. There are people well-placed who can and probably should comment on those things, and that's fine. I'm not saying nobody should talk about it. Just that, am I the best person to really get on doing it? And if I am, I'm probably phoning a lot of it in, unless it's a specific area I've done a lot of study on. So why do I have to come in? I'm just another guy with an opinion about things that you could read as a zillion places on Twitter, on Fedbook, on wherever. But what about stuff that's actually useful for human culture, history? That's what I want to do. So I hope you found it entertaining. I don't expect a massive audience. It's like a first live stream, completely unannounced, and no special guests or anything like that. But I do thank you for joining, and the several of you that did. And it's always delightful to get up and blab, whether I have an audience of 150 or an audience of about 15. I've had both, right? And it's great every time. And it's just something I love doing. So hopefully this channel can do that, and I can provide more information on more interesting topics. So God love you. Here we're approaching the Ascension, right? And so Rogation Day is incoming. Thank goodness. And so keep the faith and hold fast. Do something. Get out. Read a book. Right, and get away from Twitter. Turn Twitter off. Find something is useful, whatever it happens to be, right? And talk to people. That's the other thing. Talking to people. Everyone out there's got a story. So some people, like you have apologetics, right? You have Catholic answers, things like that. Not going to knock them. They do a lot of good work that's useful for people, but and then you have other people who are online apologists and they debates. That's great. I'm not a debater. I'm terrible at debates. Because I guess, sort of like Henry VIII, I'm not super quick on my feet to pivot and match an argument and take its import right away. I got to think about it. Got to stew it over for a while. So I'm terrible at debates. Apologetics, not great. But on the other hand, I like conversations. And until he moved away, one of my very best friends was a Presbyterian minister. And it was great to talk to him because he knows what Catholics believe. So we can cut through the usual BS and get straight to the heart of things on justification, papacy, and the scripture's authority, and so on and so forth. And it was a great conversation. Of course, he was fluent in biblical Hebrew and Greek, and I know Latin. So the other sides of that, Hebrew and Latin, we complemented each other. We could, gain quite a bit from each other's discussions. He didn't know actually that there's a whole line of thought in Thomism that's very close to what Calvin thinks on justification. And that kind of impressed him. He started reading Aquinas, and he was really impressed by Aquinas' commentaries on the scripture. So maybe a seed, I don't know. He was probably hoping he planted seeds with me when I was going through Calvin's Institutes, or maybe less so when I started pointing out the problems in Calvin's Institutes. But anyway, it was great conversation. And I prefer that mode of engagement in arguing. There's a lot of people that, they look at me on Twitter, oh, yeah, what an idiot. I don't like him. We'd probably get along great in real life. You never know. Get out of this artificial internet construct. Do things, meet people, because everybody has a story that you haven't heard yet. And you may. And it may be useful for you. So God love you. Ave Maria.